Okay, so, wow, you've given us quite a bit to unpack here. I mean, your experiences with, well, like social situations and your really deep interest in those, science and tech things, and then sci-fi too. That's pretty interesting. Plus, the family history I've talked about, and then those events you've mentioned. Oh, and you sent that PubMed article too, right?
Yeah, that article is really interesting. It looks at that connection between, well, if a kid has a traumatic brain injury early on,
Yeah.
a TBI, it can increase the risk of, well, a few things actually: ASD, ADHD, and developmental delays too.
Okay, so right off the bat, though, it's really important to be super clear about something. I mean, article summary, at least what we've got, it doesn't actually, say anything specific about oxygen deprivation or carbon monoxide poisoning, like you mentioned, being connected to ASD.
Right, exactly. And it's important for us to, to remember that our goal here isn't to diagnose anything. We're not qualified to do that.
Yeah, absolutely. The idea here is to kind of look at, your experiences and then kind of put those next to the research and see what we find. Maybe some interesting connections or like points to think about. We're just exploring stuff here, not trying to say anything definitive.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And it's, it's interesting because you describe some things that, well, sometimes they're seen in people with ASD.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah, like, figuring out social cues and finding that tricky. And then those strong interests you had early on, like in science and tech,
Hmm.
and even that thing about, being in gifted education, but still having those social challenges. And you mentioned too that sometimes people see you as, a little naive, maybe.
Hmm.
Oh, and the recruiters are reaching out about jobs for people on the autism spectrum. That's interesting too.
Yeah, but I mean, it's really important to say that, liking science and tech or feeling a little awkward sometimes, those things don't automatically mean someone has ASD.
No, not at all. I mean, people are different, and they have different personalities and
Yeah.
experiences. It's complicated.
Right, for sure.
But it's like we have to look at the whole picture. It's not just one thing,
Right.
right? So those early events you mentioned, the carbon monoxide and the possible head injury, those are things that, a doctor would think about. And then there's your family history too. How does it all fit together? That's the question.
Yeah, and even though that PubMed article, it's mainly about TBI,
Yeah.
it still shows that stuff that happens early on, it can change how the brain develops. And that could, maybe increase the risk of things like ASD. I mean, the brain is so complex.
It really is.
It's amazing how things that happen early on can have such, big effects later. And the article, it specifically said that there's a statistically significant increased risk of ASD if you have a moderate to severe TBI, in like the first 3 years of life. So that's kind of interesting to keep in mind, right?
Yeah, it is. But what's really important here is that to, get an ASD diagnosis, you have to talk to the right people, like actual medical professionals,
Yeah.
like doctors or psychologists or psychiatrists. It's not just from a conversation like we're having
Mm.
or, one research article.
Right. Yeah, absolutely.
These are experts who look at, lots of different things. They look for certain patterns of behavior and, how someone develops over time. It's a whole process.
So where does all this leave us? Well, I guess we've seen some, maybe some connections between your experiences, those early things that happened, and the research about how the brain works, especially those early brain events.
Right. And knowing all that, I mean, the most important thing is that if you're concerned about this, talk to a doctor. They can actually figure things out based on, everything you've shared and give you advice that's, specifically for you.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, what we're doing here is just, looking at things and trying to give some information, but talking to a healthcare professional, that's the next step, the really important one.
For sure. And here's something to think about. Think about how your genes and your environment and everything you've been through, how it all comes together to shape how your brain developed.
Yeah.
That's your unique story, right?
Yeah.
And talking to a doctor can give you some really interesting insights into that.
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, it's all connected, isn't it? Our genes, our experiences, everything, it all plays a part.
Absolutely.
Well, this has been a really fascinating deep dive. Thanks for listening, and we'll catch you next time. See you then.